Okay, I have the final section of visual attention to address before we get to move on, and I think that I can finish it in the next 20 minutes or so, which is about what we have left. So one of the labs that have looked at this a great deal is David Strayer's lab and a bunch of his colleagues, where in 2001, Strayer and Johnson found those results that are on the right there, that they were looking at people who were driving in a simulated situation and how many red lights did they miss and what was their reaction time with that red light. And what they were doing was they were either on a cell phone talking to someone in the laboratory who was just asking them questions about their day versus not on a cell phone at all. And clearly they missed fewer lights and their reaction time was quicker when they were not on a cell phone than when they were. If I remember correctly, they also did this with a kind of hands-free cell phone to show that this was really, as Strayer et al. In 2013 say, this is about the mental resources that are being used, that talking on the phone uses mental resources that would otherwise be used for driving the car. I have often had people, especially my older adults, ask me, well, every time you're in the car with your children or with your friends or any time else, you have people who are potentially distracting you. And yes, people with children in their car, that's also somewhat dangerous to some extent if their children are not aware that driving the car is important. But most of the time, when we were with our friends in a car, they are also aware of whatever situation that we are getting into. If there is construction on the road or something with red lights or something that's changing, and they, if anything, are helping us to navigate as opposed to just talking to us and being distracting to us because they don't know what we are dealing with in our current situation. Something he has taken out of the book, but I think most students are actually hoping that we get to talk about some of this non-normative experience and as filtered through perception, because again, everything's filtered through perception. So if we're perceiving the world differently, then we are experiencing the world differently. And some of this is from an old edition of Goldstein, and a little bit of this is from my past work with Landmark College's Institute for Research and Training. Again, Landmark College, I think I mentioned this before when we talked about language disabilities, that Landmark College is a college that allows people who learn differently to get their associate's degree, and at the same time that they're earning this associate's degree, they are training them to really advocate for themselves and to make sure that they're getting their accommodations and everything that they need. But so some of this is from them as well. But I'm going to talk a little bit about attention and autism. So attention is really important for social situations, as I'm sure most of you are somewhat aware, but let's think about this on a more specific kind of scale of what we're doing. In a social situation, we are paying attention to what other people are saying. Hopefully, we're doing well at that. We pay attention to other people's faces. We get emotional information as well as we watch their mouths to better understand what they're saying, especially if you're like me and you don't hear very well and there's any kind of background noise. I'll start looking at your mouth to see what you're saying. We also pay attention to where other people are looking, because there's this kind of joint attention that what I'm talking about, I'm typically, a lot of the times, if we're doing something together, I'm looking at what we're referring to, and you're looking at my eyes to get that information. Before we really talk about attention and autism, I'm going to talk about some of the characteristics of people who have ASD, or autism spectrum disorder, or they're on that spectrum. And they have a different neurology. They have different abilities and disabilities in their physiological processing of what's some of the areas of their regions of their brain. First of all, they have slow or impaired facial processing. They also have slower or impaired ability to perceive and process faint facial and body movements. So a lot of our emotional information that we are giving off to other people when we are talking or doing something is coming through our face and through these body movements or our body language that we might not even be very aware of ourselves as we were giving them off. But if we're very excited, people can tell, and if we're really closed off, people can tell. So they're not very perceptive to the the overall emotional context. They have impairments to those structures. So the superior temporal sulcus is damaged. Some of the cerebellum and its communication to other areas is damaged. So some of that timing is damaged. So that they have a harder time reading facial expressions, harder time processing intonation of speech. Again, those structures and the kind of right hemisphere that are allowing us to, if I get angry at you, you can hear it. If I'm happy with you, you can hear it in the intonation of my speech. They're missing some of that. They also have, and I think this is important to always leave in there, this impaired proprioceptive or vestibular processing. So when I was in library science, when I was getting that degree, I did some research on people who are of differing abilities, or I did the ADA kind of legislation of the American Disabilities Act, but really because of my own issues, I really think of it as people with differing abilities, that they suggested that if you want to kind of imagine yourself somewhat more closer to being autistic, you might want to sit on one of those yoga balls, those like big balls that they exercise with, and try to do your work while trying to balance yourself on that ball, because the proprioceptive and vestibular processing that they are doing, there's so much concentration on that of course, I mean, that is the cerebellum, so of course they're going to have some impairments to some of these other structures because their attention is not on necessarily their social world and the faint facial and body movements. Their attention is on keeping their balance and maintaining their proprioception kind of abilities. So autism is a serious developmental disorder marked by major withdrawal from people. They typically do not make eye contact, and they have difficulty gauging emotions. But if you notice some of this, most people talk about people with autism as if they aren't interested in social situations because of what we see in this kind of withdrawal and not making eye contact and the difficulty gauging emotions. But I honestly feel like a lot of the times they are just so overwhelmed that being in a social situation is even more overwhelming. I have spent some time shadowing autistic children when my sister was shadowing an autistic boy, and I went down a couple days and followed the teacher that she was really with. And I've had 2 autistic children as I was in the library science kind of world, as I was doing my outreach in my rural library, and I really felt like they were talking about things like the sounds of the lights, and I just felt like they were that they really actually wanted to be socially involved with other people, but that it was with all the impairments and what they needed to pay attention to, they were so overwhelmed, and especially in social situations, that maybe it was just sometimes too much for them. It's not that they're purposefully withdrawing or that they don't want that contact. So this is from the old Goldstein edition, where we are looking at what viewers are looking at, where their eye movements are in this scene with George Siegel and Sandy Duncan. And I'm going to go ahead and explain just a little bit of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, this movie. It's kind of a harsh movie to watch. It's an older movie where Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton are playing this couple. And if you know them, They were actually in real life married and divorced maybe 5 times, and so they're playing this couple where Richard Burton is um, the well-known, the prominent person at the university, and George Siegel, the guy in this picture, is new to the university. And if you know kind of the status of university people, when you're new, you're just really trying to impress everybody. Everything's really uncomfortable. You know, you need to worry about publishing and tenure and everything. And so they invite George Siegel over, and he brings his wife, Sandy Duncan, the actors and actresses in this movie. And if we look at, so what's happening in this scene is, let me see. I can't remember if she just threw something at him or she just slapped him. So Elizabeth Taylor, let's just say, just slapped Richard Burton across the face or just threw something at him. And of course, what a typically developing viewer is going to do is they're going to look at George Siegel's face. So we go over to George Siegel's face and look at him. He looks shocked, which is a normal reaction to that kind of just dismaying performance of somebody having that emotional scene in front of you. Most of us are going to look in his eyes because that's where we get the most information about emotion. But if we look at the viewers with autism, where are they looking? They're looking at mostly around sort of the middle of them or the right shoulder of Sandy Duncan. If they are looking at Sandy Duncan, they're looking at, most commonly, I think this is interesting, and this is something that is typical of them, they're looking to the sort of right side of her cheek, which is something that autistic people tend to do. And they've chosen Sandy Duncan, who throughout this whole movie, she is giving this kind of mask of trying not to show any emotion. And so here's another scene from the movie where they're showing the eye movements of typically developing viewers. They're in white, and viewers with autism, they're in black. And in this scene, George Siegel is asking Richard Burton, I'm just giving the actors' names because it's been so long since I've watched this movie. It's really, really hard to watch. He's asking him about the particular painting on the wall, and he's pointing at it. So what we normally do is we look at the shoulder front with the arm that he's pointing with, and then we follow his finger to figure out this is the picture he's pointing at. And then I actually think Richard Burton says something, and so they're looking at the painting itself, and then they look at Richard Burton's eyes, and they go back to George Siegel's eyes. That's kind of the typical thing to do. Whereas if you look at the people with autism, okay, they start at the right shoulder, which is uninformative in this case because he's pointing with his left hand. And then they're off in a different place. And then they're off at another different place. And then they're going back and forth trying to figure out basically what painting is he asking about in this social situation. So clearly, autistic people are attending differently than, quote, normal people. And I have this question here of what this might mean with regard to their perception and to their experience. And to some extent, I went through that a little bit more, like gave some answers a little bit more than I usually do, I think. But it's something to think about. Maybe pause. And I don't really want to give answers to that. I usually just listen for students to fill in there, and especially usually there are students who've had experience working with autistic people or doing research, and so you guys can just think about that. So if you've looked at the slides that I had for Monday, I put in the rest of my slides. I didn't want to end early, and I wasn't sure how far we'd get. Clearly, I was overestimating, though, what we could get done. And it ended with this is your brain on attention, a few slides. And what I've done is I've taken that out. That was something I did. I think it's fascinating, but I'm going to end with this summary slide now, so we can get back to sound and see if we answer these questions. So how do observers seek out new stimuli? I'm going to say yes. I'm going to tell you yes, we did answer these questions. And I'm going to end out giving the answers without you because I'm the only one here. And so And there's only the first one's really something I'm hoping people go look in their notes and do when I'm in class. But how do observers seek out new stimuli? Well, remember we have the really bottom-up influence of visual salience. Things that are visually salient in the environment are going to capture our attention, whether that is the red shirt among light blue and white, or so different colors, contrasting colors, bright colors, things that are bright in general, all of those things, movement, all of those things capture our attention. We also have some top-down influences on what influences us, how we seek out behavior. And so we talked about cognitive influences, particularly scene schemas, that what we expect to see in a scene is going to influence us, but also our personal goals within a scene, our interests within a scene, and also along with goals is the task. So if I'm the nature of the task that I'm doing, all of that's going to influence where I'm looking. If we ask, why do we perceive some things and not others? Well, here I usually do get students thinking and saying different things. I'm not expecting a certain answer, but one thing that's clear is that our conscious experience of the world is really based on what we are attending to. And so we can miss things in our environment, even right in front of our face, if we're not paying attention at that time, or if our attention is, especially if it's really focused on a particular task. And then how do these active processes really shape our perception of the world? And I feel like you're just going to have to answer that one yourself and think about that. Again, you might just pause for a minute after this and think through that how important attention is, and how much, as we as individuals kind of have these decisions to pay attention to different things, that it really is shaping our experience of the world, and tells us a lot about why we can sit through the same movie or the same class or whatever and really have a different experience.